Now that we've talked about some of the important nutrients for life, the important nutrients for ecosystems, for plant growth, that sort of thing, we can talk about biogeochemical cycles. Biogeochemical cycles are the pathways that various nutrients take moving from the atmosphere to the lithosphere, the rock and soil layer, the hydrosphere, the water, to the biosphere, living things, and then back to the atmosphere or back to the soil or however they happen to take their pathway. Each biogeochemical cycle is going to be a little bit different, so we're going to talk about each one. But even though each one is different, they do share certain commonalities. For one thing, there are reservoirs of these chemicals, reservoirs of these nutrients. You have the biotic reservoirs, which is plants and animals and fungi and bacteria. We have all of these chemicals, these nutrients inside of our systems. We are made of nitrogen, we are made of carbon, we are made of oxygen, we are made of hydrogen. Same goes for all of the plants that surround us and all of the mushrooms, all of the bacteria. Everything that is alive in the world has these materials built up inside of us. So we are a reservoir for these nutrients, and when we die and decay, or when leaves fall from trees and return to the soil, those nutrients transition from the biosphere, the living components of the environment, back over to the soil, the non-living component of the environment, which would be the lithosphere, the soil and rock layer. Therefore, the soil and rock represents another reservoir where these chemicals can be found. The water is another place where these chemicals can be found. There is carbon mixed up in the water column. There's oxygen mixed up in the water column. There's nitrogen mixed up in the water column. The atmosphere has all of these chemicals mixed up inside. There's carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. There's oxygen in our atmosphere. There's nitrogen in our atmosphere. Actually, our atmosphere is mostly nitrogen. So on Earth, there is a certain amount of carbon. There's a certain amount of oxygen. There's a certain amount of nitrogen, all of these chemical nutrients that we talked about. And every little scrap of it has to be in one of these living or non-living reservoirs. It has to be either in living things, it has to be in the soil, in the rock, it has to be in the air, or it has to be in the water. Biogeochemical cycles are just the pathways that the nutrients follow to go from one to the other. This picture shows a general concept of how they work. We'll have some non-living reservoir, some abiotic reservoir, either soil or air or rocks or oceans or lakes, and it undergoes its own geological processes, but eventually the nutrients in that non-living reservoir will become available to producers. Producers are plants and algae and blue-green bacteria, things that are able to do photosynthesis. I mentioned in an earlier video that producers, things that are able to do photosynthesis, are the interface between the living and the non-living realms of the ecosystem. They are what are able to take materials and energy from non-living resources and put them into the living biosphere, into usable forms for organisms. Producers will take up these nutrients from the non-living reservoir, and then they will be eaten by consumers. Consumers is a term which applies to any organism that has to eat other organisms in order to survive. So if you have, say, an animal that eats a plant, that is a consumer. We call it an herbivore, but it's a kind of consumer. That consumer may be eaten by other consumers. We would call that a carnivore, and we'll talk about the food chain again a little bit later on. But so producers take energy and nutrients from abiotic reservoirs, then they are consumed by consumers. Consumers can pass these nutrients between each other, but eventually consumers will die and their bodies will decay and they will be broken down by decomposers. Decomposers are fungi and bacteria that are going to take all of the material components of plants and animals and everything that dies in an ecosystem and return them back to their base components. They're going to really disassemble everything back into its most fundamental chemical structure and return it back to the abiotic reservoirs. It'll return it back to the air, back to the soil. Once there, it's available for producers to utilize again. So the cycle begins once more, and like I said, it's a cycle, so it just goes round and round and round and round. Chemicals cycle throughout ecosystems. This whole process is sustained by the constant influx of energy from outside sources. As long as there's energy pumping in, we will be able to keep this process going. So you could imagine a molecule of nitrogen in the soil, that's the lithosphere, taken up by plants, that's the producers. That plant is eaten by a rabbit, that's a consumer. That rabbit dies, its body is decomposed by fungi and bacteria, and that material then returns to the soil, so the nutrients, the nitrogen, is now in the soil, where it can be taken back up by producers, the plants again, and then eaten by another herbivore, another consumer, and round it goes. This is the general scheme of chemical cycling, but each biogeochemical cycle will have some nuances to discuss, and we're also going to talk about the ways in which human activities influence these cycles. The most familiar biogeochemical cycle to many of you is going to be the hydrologic cycle, or what you may call the water cycle. This is driven by two major processes, one, evaporation, and two, precipitation. Evaporation is the transition of liquid water to the gas phase. It becomes water vapor when enough energy is added to it, when it becomes warm enough to escape into the vapor phase. And precipitation is when water vapor in the air cools down and collects together and becomes water droplets and then falls back down in the form of rain. Now, evaporation is a process powered by the sun. That's where the energy for evaporation comes from, and allows water to rise up against the force of gravity, which imparts potential energy into it. Potential energy is stored energy. So it raises up that water into the sky, which can then fall down in another location. And this energy that the water cycle imparts is actually really important, because as water lands uphill, it can bring with it little bits of soil and silt and other particles, which will influence some of the other biogeochemical cycles later. We call that weathering and erosion. But for right now, evaporation and precipitation are the two major factors that influence the hydrologic cycle. Some of that precipitation is going to infiltrate into the ground and be stored in rock layers, and we call that groundwater. And this is when we tap wells in order to get well water out. This is what we're tapping into, is the groundwater. Make sure you're getting these vocabulary terms down: evaporation, precipitation, infiltration, and groundwater. Any water that doesn't infiltrate down to the groundwater is just going to run over the surface, and we refer to that as surface runoff. And it will end up in rivers and creeks and streams and lakes, and perhaps eventually flow down to the ocean. It might also just evaporate off and end up back in the atmosphere. The speed at which groundwater can be replenished is going to be related to how much precipitation a given area has, and what the quality of the rock and soil in that area is as well. And on top of that, how much that surface has been modified. If you have a lot of city streets and concrete and pavement, there's no opportunity for the water to actually infiltrate down. Those are impervious surfaces. Water will just flow right over the top of that. Whereas in a more natural setting, water actually can saturate down to the ground and begin to trickle through the layers and end up in the groundwater. So the more urbanized an area is, the slower the rate of groundwater recharge. On the other hand, the more surface water that you end up with, the more flooding you're going to end up with, the more dramatic any flooding events will end up being. You may remember in earlier videos that I mentioned that the loss of natural habitats is sometimes associated with increase in flood damage. Now there is one more piece of vocabulary on this slide: watershed and drainage basin. The land from which the surface water drains into a body of water is referred to as the watershed or drainage basin. So what exactly does that mean? If you were to imagine a pond or a lake or a river, they are always going to show up in locations in landscapes that are the furthest downhill. And this is because as rain falls on a landscape, it's going to run over the surface, and the droplets of water will begin collecting together as they move downhill. And you're going to get the largest collection of water the furthest downhill that you go. So the places where it's pulling together are going to be in these lakes and rivers, and it's going to be really far down in the landscape. The drainage basin is all of the parts of the surrounding landscape that participate in funneling water to the same lake or pond or river. So if you imagine a landscape as a rolling series of hills with a whole bunch of peaks and valleys and dips and bowls in it, you could imagine a drainage basin as being one of those bowls in the landscape, because any rain that falls anywhere in that drainage basin is going to eventually collect down to the bottom in the same lake or river or pond. Now I'm saying imagine it as a bowl because that's easier to conceptualize, but every location is part of some watershed. Because no matter where you are, if rain falls on the ground, it's going to flow somewhere, and it's going to flow somewhere predictably. So a person in one location might be part of the Lake Erie watershed, and a person in another location might be part of the Mississippi River watershed. Now, since I'm going to all the trouble to describe this concept, you might be asking the question, why is all of this important to know? And the reason is that anything that happens within a watershed is going to affect the aquatic ecosystems at the bottom of that watershed. So if there's a lot of farms in that watershed, or a lot of golf courses that use artificial fertilizers, those artificial fertilizers are going to get washed through the precipitation, through surface runoff, to the aquatic ecosystems in the lakes and rivers and ponds at the bottom of the watershed. When we think about pollution, we often think about a pipe coming from a factory that's dumping some sort of chemical sludge directly into a waterway, but we less often realize the effect that, for example, all of the residential lawns in a county-wide area could have if all of them are using herbicides. Say you're using some sort of herbicide to cut down on the amount of weeds in your lawn, and the amount of herbicide that you spray on your lawn, maybe, it's kind of spread out throughout your lawn, it's a few bottles of it, but every single homeowner is using a few bottles of this herbicide on their lawn, and when it rains, all of that runoff is going to be collected together in the same watershed and end up in the same aquatic ecosystem. So all of that herbicide, all of that plant poison is going to end up washing and being funneled and being concentrated to a single location, which can have just as big of an effect as a single source of pollution that is pumping it directly into the ecosystem. So because of the way watersheds operate, dispersed pollutants can actually be concentrated together. Just another example of how individual actions can actually add up to pretty big consequences. So the overall hydrologic cycle goes like this. We have some reservoir of liquid water. I'll start right here. It actually doesn't matter where we start because it's a cycle, so it goes around in a circle. That liquid water on the lake evaporates. It gets exposed to sunlight. There's an input of solar energy, of heat. And as the energy charges up these water molecules, they start moving around. The faster they move around, the more easily they can escape into the gas phase. So liquid water transitions into a gas, into water vapor, and it moves from the hydrosphere to the atmosphere, right? From the liquid state to the gaseous state. It moves from one abiotic reservoir to another. So liquid water evaporates into the atmosphere, where it collects together, and once it spreads out and cools off, as it rises in the atmosphere, the pressure decreases. That allows it to spread out. As pressure decreases, the temperature also is going to decrease, which causes it to return to a liquid state. These droplets can collect back together, and once they collect together, they can form rain droplets, and they will return back to Earth in the form of precipitation. The rain will land over a wide area, but some of it will land uphill, and it will slowly trickle its way down, and sometimes it builds up to quite a torrent, creating surface runoff over the surface. And notice that the force of evaporation is what's bringing it up into the sky, and then precipitation is allowing it to fall back down, and that's what's powering this cycle. So the input of energy from the sun is allowing it to go up and down and up and down and up and down, and that's what's putting energy into this cycle. But the runoff then can take the water back down to the lakes and rivers and streams, which completes one part of the cycle. However, some of the water that is part of the precipitation will also trickle down. It'll infiltrate down into the groundwater, and you get what we call an underground aquifer. There are two types that are mentioned in this image right here. You have confined aquifers and unconfined aquifers. Confined aquifers place the water between two layers of impermeable rock. So it's trickling in from somewhere, but it's being stored in between these two layers of impermeable rock. So it's very difficult to access, and therefore it's called confined. And it could be under quite a bit of pressure. Sometimes this water can escape, and it comes through, and you see this little note right here. It's called a flowing artesian. That's essentially almost a natural pipe that is formed that allows some of this water to be able to escape. And it emerges as kind of like a natural spring. Unconfined aquifers have the top is not concealed by a permeable rock layer, and the landscape might actually dip down low enough at a certain point where the landscape is below the water table. The level of water within the groundwater is called the water table. And when this happens, this is where you get a permanent lake. A lake isn't just a puddle of water that's collected. Generally, they're going to form at areas that are low enough lying that they actually dip below the water table. So even when there hasn't been rain for an extended period of time, the lake water isn't just going to all evaporate away because it's constantly being refilled by the available groundwater. However, that also means that if you have a lot of communities around that lake that are pumping water from the groundwater for like well water, if they're getting it from the same source, then that means that excess pumping can actually deplete the water level of that lake. It'll go down and down and down because it's losing its source of replenishment. So let me make sure we got all the terms on this picture taken care of. We have evaporation. We have precipitation. We talked about runoff. That's surface runoff going over the surface, and that can pick up other materials along the way. We'll talk later about erosion and more about nutrient pollution that can be a result of that. But that can end up in lakes and rivers and streams. We have the lake. We have the confined recharge area, and I mentioned earlier that the confined aquifers have to get their water in from somewhere, and then it ends up between these two rock layers. So the place where it's actually getting recharged from, that's the confined recharge area. That's where the water is actually able to get in. It's going to be uphill somewhere so that it can kind of funnel its way in. But the unconfined aquifer can have a much broader area where it's getting recharged from because it doesn't have this thick layer of rock over the top. So the whole region can be the unconfined aquifer recharge area. The last term that's on here that I haven't mentioned is transpiration. Transpiration is a form of evaporation. It's evaporation specifically from the leaves of plants. And plants, you may know, get their water from their roots. They pull it up from the groundwater. And then it moves through the tissues of those plants, through those trees, all the way up against the force of gravity. And then once it's used for sometimes it's used for photosynthesis, but sometimes it just evaporates straight from the leaves into the air. So in a way, trees facilitate this exchange between groundwater and the atmosphere. If it wasn't for trees with their deep roots pulling water out of the groundwater and sending it back up to the atmosphere through transpiration, evaporation from the leaves, then there would really be no natural mechanism for groundwater to evaporate back into the atmosphere. So in this way, trees and forests actually act as rain machines. We call the rainforest a rainforest because it rains a lot there, but it's also a rainforest because it is an active rain machine. And that process, once again, takes water from the groundwater, lithosphere, soil, groundwater, rock, lithosphere, to the biological system, the tree, so biosphere, and then delivers it to the atmosphere. So we have all of those different biotic and abiotic reservoirs being involved here. Atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, biosphere, all of them attended to in this one biogeochemical cycle. Now, after we go through the basic components of each biogeochemical cycle, I'll also talk about the ways in which humans affect that cycle, because this is, after all, humans and the environment. So, how do humans affect the hydrologic cycle or impair the hydrologic cycle? Well, one way we do this is that we use a lot of fresh water. The Earth's surface is covered in water. 75% of the surface is covered in water, but the vast majority of that is ocean. Right? It's almost all salt water. And the majority of the fresh water that exists is actually bound up in glaciers. So the amount of Earth's surface that's available as surface runoff or groundwater that is available for freshwater ecosystems, for any kind of like forests to be able to use, because that's what land plant life needs in order to be able to survive, for animals to be able to drink, for industries to be able to use, for residential homes to be able to use, for bathing, for drinking, for any kind of process, sanitation and watering crops, and all of the different uses that it gets. It's less than 1% of the total amount of water on Earth. And in the places where we are extracting fresh water, we typically extract it faster than the natural rate of precipitation is capable of replacing it. Where we pull it up from the groundwater by using wells and other systems, it's typically faster than groundwater infiltration rates are able to replace. Where we pull it up from lakes and rivers, we pull it up faster than precipitation rates are able to replace. Or we change the landscape in order to deliver that water to other locations that are relatively water parched, but then our reservoirs of water slowly deplete over time. And currently, humans are using about half of the Earth's reliable runoff surface water. We also clear-cut vegetation and replace it with impervious surfaces. So as I mentioned before, if you have lots of concrete and asphalt, water cannot penetrate those surfaces. It can't move through them. So that decreases the surface area of the landscape that is available for water to be able to move through the ground and get into the groundwater. And therefore that decreases the infiltration rate, the groundwater recharge rate. It also increases the speed of surface water moving through cities and things like that, which increases the water load for flooding. In addition to that, clear-cutting vegetation interferes with the ecosystem's natural ability to exchange the groundwater with the atmosphere, so we're fundamentally just altering the relationship between these different biotic and abiotic reservoirs. I've mentioned wetlands before. Wetlands have this nice feature where they store lots and lots and lots of storm water and then allow it to be released slowly downhill. And if you have your city downhill, that's a really nice feature because that reduces the amount of water you're going to have to deal with at any given time. But wetlands usually end up being in locations that are really attractive to developers if we could just fill in the wetland and cover it in impervious surfaces. But that removes that nice ecosystem service that we had, as well as all the biodiversity that's there. And wetlands are some of the most biodiverse ecosystems that we have in a lot of these areas. Now, I've already mentioned this part, but this is not only bad news for cities, but since wetlands are part of the floodplain, filling them in and covering them with impervious surfaces means that water that's coming through is no longer going to spread neatly over that floodplain and deliver all the nutrients that are being carried with that water into the ecosystems that were there. Instead, that water will continue to be channeled at a very high rate of speed downhill to the aquatic ecosystems at the bottom, perhaps down all the way to the ocean, and whatever nutrient load they're carrying is going to be delivered all at once to that location. So this removes nutrients from ecosystems that require them and delivers them to places that maybe are already overloaded with them. Approximately 70% of the water that we withdraw from surface runoff and groundwater is never actually returned. It's lost through evaporation and inefficiency, or ends up in the ocean where it becomes salt water and therefore not usable fresh water. Fresh water, like any renewable resource, needs to be used at a slow enough pace for it to come back. And if we are removing it from the ecosystem faster than it can be replenished, then eventually we are going to run out of it. And there are some areas that are facing water scarcity issues. They are in historic droughts and they cannot deliver water to their citizens or for their crops. And each of these leads to further problems downstream that, again, we will talk about later on in the course. Irrigation is our biggest use of water. So agriculture is our biggest use of water, about 70% of the water humans use. And then industries after that, and cities and residents is about 10% of the total amount of water that we use. So that's water from your faucet, for your showers, for brushing your teeth, for drinking, for your toilet, all that, for washing your clothes. That's the last 10% of that pie slice. The overwhelming largest use of water is going to be agriculture. And that's why there has been a lot of technology and a lot of speculation about ways we could improve the way that we irrigate crops. There are new ideas about ways to go about it. For example, a lot of times we irrigate our crops, we spray them. If you've ever been out at a farm, you've probably seen the kind of large sprinkler systems that they use in order to spray the tops of the crop. A lot of that water ends up just evaporating away. So there have been ideas about, what if we tried to irrigate certain crops at night so that the water has more time to get down to the soil, and then the plants can take it up more easily that way without it evaporating off immediately? Or what if we ran pipes along the roots and then we just sort of dripped water down through the pipes, which for some crops that's an extremely viable solution. For other crops that might not be a viable solution. And there are a dozen other ideas about improving irrigation as well. Each one has pros and cons, but there are definitely some improvements we can make about the way that we utilize water.